ballot question would involve the purchase of the assets of investor-owned electric T&D facilities in Maine, transmission and distribution facilities in Maine. So the first question I have is, what are the assets that would be purchased? And because everybody thinks about, they just say CMP and Versant, but what does CMP and Versant own? What are the assets of CMP and Versant? And I just want to see if generally people agree that CMP not only has its system, but also has 78.3% of MEPCO, which is the transmission line running between Wiscasset toward New Brunswick, 38% of Maine Yankee. I'm not sure what the value of that would be, but that's the Maine Yankee Atomic Power Company. Versant is 21.7% MEPCO, 12% Maine Yankee, and also owns parts of the Chester Service transmission area, East Branch Improvement. So is that generally understood, Jim, that those would be the assets purchased if there was a purchase?
I think it's fair to say none of us in this room know exactly what those assets will be. And I think ultimately it's going to be for a court to decide. But I'll give you an example. I mentioned earlier that I had worked on a similar issue in the 1990s. One of them was the Rangeley Water Company. The Rangeley Water Company was very small. It had wood stave pipe, which we had to figure out, is that being transferred or not? That was an issue in front of the court. Another issue was contributed property. There was a new development and the customer paid for that new development, and the question was, does that new development paid for by the customer get counted in the assets of the acquiring utility? Ultimately, a court said yes. We're going to be fighting about Maine Yankee, MEPCO, Chester, every substation. We're going to be fighting about the transmission lines. Are they going to be taken? Are they not going to be taken? Who's responsible for it? That's why this is a 5-year litigation. It took 3.5 years for little Rangeley Water Company to figure out what its value was. Multiply that by billions of dollars statewide in 2 different utilities. That's why we think we're not going to know an answer until probably 2030. It may include those assets, and we just don't know.
Seth or Lucy?
Thank you for that excellent question. So the legislation defines in section 4001 utility facilities. This is what the Country Power Company will be required to go forward and refinance, as Lucy said, with a low interest mortgage, not a very high monopoly rent. Utility facilities are, and this is well understood in the industry, the plant that is used or useful in providing transmission and distribution utility service. The utility properties, which are mentioned, such as MEPCO, such as Maine Yankees, nuclear waste, thank you for that, such as the new NECEC corridor, which does look like it will be built. Those are optional. There is no need for the new board to require that those be turned over and to require that a value be established. So the new board is only required to essentially take over what is rate-based now. Rate-base is a term in the industry which defines what the utility itself says it has and what the utility itself says it is worth. It's also known as a net utility plant. In the annual reports to FERC and the annual reports to the PUC, CMP and Versant are required to list those assets and to value them. This is how we establish our rates. And they have a very strong incentive to list those out, because guess what? For every dollar that they have put in, they get between $1 and $2 back in addition to the $1. So our rates are defined based on this, this essentially a dynamic that involves very low risk for the investors and very strong, essentially guaranteed rates of return. So this is how we know what will be taken over. And just quickly, LEI, the London Economics Institute, which did, London Economics Incorporated, which did the study for the Public Utilities Commission of our 2019 legislation, very similar, said this would take between 3 and 5 years, not the longer timeline that's being claimed by CMP Inversions. And that in their economic modeling, they put it at 4 years. They also referenced exactly the same case that Mr. Cohen just spoke to and said, here's what we learned from that, here's how you can make it faster in the law. So we took their advice and we made those improvements.
Thank you. So let me follow up on cost, because that's a key issue for a lot of people. So I've seen in the literature on the website for Maine Affordable Energy and elsewhere, the number that you mentioned, Jim, $13.5 billion. What's the basis of that? What's the factual support for that?
Thanks for the question, Jeff. Hopefully all of you have in front of you a handout, and if you look at the side with the map, in the lower right-hand corner, there is a timeline, and the timeline is important. So Jeff is correct, and there was a study that was done in 2020 by London Economics International on behalf of the Public Utilities Commission. It was directed by the Maine legislature. And what London Economics estimated is that if the takeover occurred in 2024, using a net book multiplier of 1.5 times net book value, the value would be only $8.2 billion. So if you look at that timeline, first of all, there will not be a transaction and a takeover in 2024. It is going to be some number of years down the road. At minimum, it's going to be 2027. Even that's what Pine Tree Power estimates, but it could be well beyond that. We estimated 2030 back in 2020. So 3 years ago, we said if it's 10 years, which is the average takeover length of time, it would be 2030. Now it could be beyond 2030. But if you assume 2030, every year there's new poles, new wires, new substations, the value of the utilities goes up. Second variable of time, of net book multiplier. Now, London Economics didn't do a comparable sales analysis, so if you ever buy and sell a house and you want to know what your house is worth, you look at comparable sales and what they sold for. There are not a lot of utility transactions. So if you look at comparable takeover values, they range between 2 and 5 times net book value. If you pick the low end of that as 2, that's how you get $13.5 billion. That's it, just those 2 variables. Now, it could be a different number, we don't know. And Jeff, I can talk more about the rates themselves, but I don't want to go beyond your question.
I'll hold up on that, but let me turn over to Lucy or Seth, because when I read the CMP and Versant reports to the Public Utilities Commission filed in March and April, CMP's total assets and debits are about $5.2 billion, Versant $1.46 billion. It's about $6.7 billion. So how much does Pine Tree Power think it would have to raise in bond sales or otherwise to purchase the assets of the T&D utilities in Maine?
Thanks so much for the question. So I think what we've seen over and over is that CMP and Versant have every incentive to mislead and inflate here. They are trying to protect the $187 million in profit that they make every single year. That is not what I would call an objective analysis. And when we say we studied, who is that we? The consulting firm hired to do this analysis has systematically gone around the country doing this kind of analysis for other investor-owned utilities that are similarly facing takeover attempts. They are a consulting firm that specifically fights for investor-owned utilities doing this kind of analysis. What we know is that exactly as Jeff mentioned, CMP and Versant have to list their assets. So they have told us what they are worth, and it's a fraction of what they spend $27 million trying to tell us on the television that they're worth. As for how that number got inflated, there's a lot of reasons for that, one of which is, as Jim was saying, well, we won't be able to buy it right away. And if you look at the analysis, they say, oh, CMP's gonna invest $1 billion before we can take it over. I think anyone who's been looking at our grid knows that CMP is not really interested in investing $1 billion into our grid. And then the second piece is this multiplier. That's how much over the purchase price that we are going to have to pay, how much over the actual listed value we are going to have to pay. They use a multiplier of 2, so we'll have to pay twice what it's worth. That's completely out of the realm of possibility. What we know is that utilities are bought and sold. It's not that it happens so rarely. That's actually exactly how we ended up in this situation, is that CMP and Versant were both sold to foreign corporations. When Versant was sold, it was at a 1.4 times multiplier. The LEI study and Richard Silkman's fantastic analysis both used a multiplier of 1.5. At a 1.5 times multiplier, we're saving money, we're saving $9 billion. So if we were sold at a 1.4, which is the most recent utility sale in Maine, we would see even more savings. And I think that's really what we know here, is that there is a lot on the table for sure, and it's savings for Mainers and for Maine ratepayers.
So can I just push you a little bit on that, because Pine Tree Power in its published materials, and you sort of gave this number, says that consumers would save $367 on day one. How does that happen on day one? I think, didn't LEI say that there'd be an increase in rates early on before they start going down?
Thanks for that great question. So London Economics, in its analysis for the PUC, did say that in their base case, we would affect the transition in 4 years. The acquisition multiple will be 1.5, not 2 to 5, as we just heard, 2 at minimum. That was out of the realm of possibility, as Lucy said. And Versant did just sell for 1.47.
You mean, well, Emera sold.
Sorry, Versant purchased Emera, that's right. The city of Calgary, the government of Calgary in Alberta did purchase Versant for 1.47%. But
I'm sorry, can you 1.47 billion?
1.47. Can you repeat the question?
Well, the question was, how do consumers save $367?
Thank you.
One,
Yes. Okay,
and
so
the rates are supposed to go up.
there is additional savings in transmission. The public advocate just issued an opinion on how transmission will be dealt with. That's consistent with what Dr. Silkman and other unpaid independent Maine economists said, which is that we will save money on transmission. LEI and Concentric, CMP's consultant, thought that we would have to actually subsidize the other New England states, essentially share the savings from our smart meter here in enacting question 3, to share 92% of those savings on regional transmission with other New England states. And so both LEI and Concentric assumed, and the public advocate has recently disagreed, that we would need to share the wealth in that way. I've spoken with FERC's general counsel verbally. We know from the public advocate's research as well, and from established precedents, specifically the case with the city of Vernon and FERC's decision on the city of Vernon, that we will be allowed to keep the savings from the transmission piece, the high voltage regional systems. That brings in an additional $4 billion in savings over and above LEI's baseline assumption, which is that we would save money, yes, over 30 years with a possible slight uptick in the first few years. So what we are using to answer the question more succinctly, and I apologize for the long answer, is the analysis by 3 Maine economists, all PhD Harvard and Yale economists, Dr. Richard Silkman, Dr. Dick Woodbury, Dr. David Vail, a Republican, a Democrat, and independent, who concur that for some of the reasons I just outlined and others, we will save $9 billion over 30 years. $9 billion over 30 years is a greater saving, even greater savings than what LEI projects. And if you divide $9 billion by 30 and by the number of customers, you get an average of $367. So that is the simple math, and I hope that helps.
Thank you. So Tina, I want to turn to you.